Hello everyone, today I'm doing part two of my project. My lesson is going to be on the American Revolution, specifically the acts that led up to the American Revolution. I really am not too technologically gifted, so I'm on the Voice Memos app. I was not able to do a slideshow or anything like that. I could not figure it out. So I'm just going to be doing a voice memo of my presentation and my lesson for you guys. Okay, students, so I really liked the discussion that we had. So now we're going to shift into the American Revolution and its origins. So, the main goal of my lesson is to make you guys understand that the American Revolution did not just occur overnight, but that many acts passed by the British government enraged the colonists, leading to the American Revolution. Chronologically, these acts are the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, the Tea Act, and the Intolerable Acts. These are all really important to understand and remember, as they're all different, although they are lumped into the same category historically. We kind of just associate them as, oh, acts that the king passed because he wanted to. But they're all different, and it's important to understand their causes and the effects on the colonies. So, first, we're going to be discussing the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act was passed in 1764 and also went by the American Revenue Act, which you guys don't need to remember, but it's a little fun fact. And it was basically a revenue raising act passed by the British Parliament. It was aimed to end the smuggling of sugar and other items into the colonies via the French and Dutch West Indies. The Dutch West Indies and East Indies, that's basically just the Caribbean area where a lot of sugar was grown. Um, this act was passed to increase the revenues of the British Empire following the French and Indian War, which we covered in our previous few classes. The British government needed funds and money to pay the soldiers and many government officials in the colonies because of the French and Indian War, and passing taxes on the colonies was the perfect solution. England really tried to keep trade under control in the colonies, almost keeping it like a monopoly. If only English sugar and molasses could be sold, then they could charge whatever prices they wanted. This act was perfect to boost revenue for the British Empire. This act imposed duties on sugar, molasses, and other goods imported into the colonies. A duty is basically a tax for anyone that doesn't know yet. Duties are still used today. For example, we could see a duty on a luxury good such as a handbag or jewelry or an expensive electronic, a car from another country. As well as raising revenue for the colony, the other purpose of this was to enforce stricter trade regulations because a lot of smuggling was going on, as previously mentioned. And this act was also enforced by vice admiralty courts to try violators without a jury, which is very different to what we have today. Would anyone like to take a guess what a vice admiralty court is? Yes, in the back there. That's a good answer. Basically, it is a juryless court that the British colonies used in the past that were used to grant jurisdiction over legal matters. These were used especially in maritime activities, such as things between merchants and seamen or traders like that on the seas. The economic impact of this act really was not too good for many in the colonies. It hurt a lot of the colonial merchants who relied on cheap foreign molasses, and this just raised the price of everything. It also disrupted the colonial economy by increasing the cost of imported goods. So, how would you guys feel if prices were raised on a lot of items very rapidly in your neighborhood? Yes, you guys would not be happy about that. No one would be happy about that. As we all know, the colonists were not afraid to speak up, and many protested this act, arguing that it was unconstitutional since they had no representation in the British Parliament. So, the legacy of this act is it really set a precedent for the British Parliament on how to go about their acts, how to pass them, how to enforce them, the purpose of them. But it also set a precedent for the patriots as well on how to stand up to these bills, how to take action against them, and really uniting the people against the colony, against the British Empire, excuse me, when they had to in times like this. It really helped the colonists resist the British policies and laid the groundwork for the American Revolution. Another act that we're going to cover is the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was passed in 1765 and it was the first direct tax imposed by Britain on the American colonies. It required that many printed materials in the colonies could be produced on paper be produced in London carrying a specifically designed revenue stamp. So many of these goods on paper, they had special seals or stamps on them that showed that they were from the British and the British produced them, and it was really a way to show that it was theirs and no one else could print things. The Stamp Act might have a little bit of a deceiving name. Could you guys take a guess on some items that it applied to? Yes, that's a good guess. Newspapers, paper, yes. The items that the Stamp Act put taxes on were newspapers, legal documents, licenses, almanacs, and even playing cards and dice, all essential goods that the colonists used. It was passed for similar reasons because the British had to pay off troops stationed in North America following the French and Indian War, and it mandated that stamps be purchased with British currency, not colonial paper money. This, again, gave control, I should say, to Great Britain and took away a lot of independent power that the 13 colonies felt they might have had. Again, the reaction was very similar by the colonists. Many viewed the Stamp Act as a violation of their rights, and they argued that they needed some form of a representative body that could tax them, and the Parliament could not legally tax them. And with the Stamp Act, this is when we start to hear the phrase, no taxation without representation. And the colonists didn't just take any unorganized action or some loose protest. They actually took a big step, forming the Stamp Act Congress that met in October of 1765 in New York City. They drafted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances and petitioned to the King and the Parliament to repeal this act. Some groups, like the Sons of Liberty, also emerged, and they used mob violence to intimidate those who distributed stamps. Eventually, we will see the Stamp Act repealed in March of 1766, but this would not be the end to any of these acts because the British government would pass the Townshend Acts only a year later in 1767. So, the Townshend Acts were a series of measures introduced by Charles Townshend in England, aiming at exerting British authority over American colonies and raising some more revenue. As we can see here, there's a similar pattern to why England passed these acts. Mostly it was due to taxes and asserting their control over the colonies to let them know who's in charge. So we have to think logically here. Many of these acts imposed taxes on goods. They didn't take any direct actions against individuals, which we will see later, or groups. So why would they pass these taxes? The only reason to make sense of is because they needed money. And this money, which is the common pattern that we keep hearing, is due to the French and Indian War. So basically, the British government needed money to pay those from the French and Indian War. Getting back to the Townshend Acts, what do you guys think the Townshend Acts taxed? Might be a little bit less obvious. You can't really tell from the answer, so I'll just tell you guys. It passed duties on imports such as glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The revenue granted was intended to pay the salaries of colonial governors, judges, ensuring their loyalty to the British Crown. It also passed laws against smuggling, which was becoming a huge issue in the colonies, especially in the South, as England wanted to keep the colonies under their control. The colonists were not afraid to respond, as they formed groups like the Sons of Liberty here, as they did with the Stamp Act, and they protest and spoke their mind on these issues. The act led to the increase of tensions and incidents such as the Boston Massacre in 1770, which we will cover in one of our next classes because it is a very important topic, so it deserves its own lesson. Many of the Townshend Acts were repealed, though, around 1770, except for the tax on tea, which remained in place because tea was such an important good and needed by everyone, so it could easily be taxed, almost without a question. Such an act would lead to the Tea Act in 1773 and eventually the Boston Tea Party. The Tea Act was designed to aid the financially struggling British East India Company by granting them monopoly over American tea trade. So, many of you might not have heard of the British East India Company and ask, what does India even have to do with the 13 colonies? The British East India Company was a joint stock company founded in the 1600s that had a lot of control in the Indian Ocean and was very prominent in Asia. Some of you guys might be asking, what does that have to do here, though? Well, we have to remember that Great Britain and the British Empire was very global and expanded just like far beyond just the 13 colonies. We have to take this into the global perspective. A lot of the goods that Britain needed, such as tea, that came from India, and the British East India Company operated all over the world. So, for those of you who are, probably all of you who are unsure, what do you guys think a joint stock company is? It sounds like something we know today, like stocks. Yes, it is someone that can sell shares in a company. Individuals were able to sell shares like shareholders would today with stocks, and as they would buy them, they could sell them freely to other individuals too. We can go more in depth about the British East India Company if you guys would like. If you guys have any questions after class, feel free to come to me. I can talk about it more. Prior to the Tea Act, the British East India Company was building up a huge surplus of tea and needed to get rid of it quickly and profitably. The colonies served as the perfect solution. This act effectively granted the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, as they could sell it there for the price that they willed. The response by many of the patriots, especially those that were angry from the start, was not good though. In December of 1773, colonists disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, as what we know as the Boston Tea Party today, and dumped 342 chests of tea into the Boston Harbor as a protest. Again, we will talk more about the main figures and more details in another class, because this is a very important topic and a very interesting time too to learn about that we need some more time to discuss in class. Those are some of the major brief overview details, and similar protests would happen all around the colonies. This was the most important one though, and largest. So, as many of you guys could imagine, when the British Crown heard about this and King George in England heard about this chaos, he was understandably enraged. From this chaos, we see the Intolerable Acts come about, which might be some of the most famous that you guys have heard about in the past. The Intolerable Acts were passed in 1774, and they acted as a response to the Boston Tea Party and closed the Boston Harbor. These acts united the colonies against Britain and led to the First Continental Congress. The Intolerable Acts had four main provisions that many colonists viewed as clearly unjust and illegal. These parts of the act must be analyzed in order to get the true scope of how enraged and angry the colonists truly were. The first act was the Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston until the East India Company was compensated for the destroyed tea. Both those involved and not involved with the Boston Tea Party were understandably very angered by this. The second was the Massachusetts Government Act, which altered the Massachusetts Charter, reducing the self-governance and increasing royal control in the colonies. This is when we see the local British governors and British law officials gain much more power, and the colonial powers basically have no control. Thirdly, we see the Administration of Justice Act, which allowed British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in Britain or another colony. This meant that British individuals who maybe abused colonists or did something wrong would be shipped straight to Britain or one of the other colonies to face a trial. This could lead to very partial trials that let them basically go scathe-free in receiving sentences or really getting justice for their wrongdoings. And finally, we have the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act required colonists to house British troops in their home if necessary. This is the most well-known part of the act that you guys are definitely familiar with. As it is easy to imagine, many colonists were extremely unhappy forcing British troops to be quartered in their houses. Quartering, that's where we get the name from. They had to provide food for them and care and basically accommodate them as they pleased. I'm sure everyone today would not be happy with this by any means, for whatever purpose. This had the longest lasting effect on the colonies, and was probably the biggest spark to the whole igniting of the American Revolution. Now, none of these acts really targeted African Americans or the free black population in 13 colonies, but we are going to go over some important effects on them that really put a bit more stress on their situations. So, first, it increased tensions and instability in the colonies. The Intolerable Act heightened tensions a lot between the colonies and Britain, leading to increased instability and conflict. The environment in this situation led the enslaved black people to live under more precarious and harsh conditions. There was also a large economic disruptions with the closing of the Boston Harbor under the Boston Port Act and disrupted trade in the economy. It affected all residents, but also affected the enslaved black people who faced even harsher conditions as their owners felt the financial hardship of the situation. And finally, the increased military presence due to the Quartering Act increased surveillance over the black enslaved population, which reduced already their limited freedoms. So, students, these were the main acts that were pivotal in escalating the tensions between Britain and the American colonies, which ultimately led to the revolutionary movement. It's important to note for you guys to write down, it was mostly the Stamp, Townshend Acts, and Tea Acts especially that led to the widest resentment in the 13 colonies. These measures were seen as violations of colonial rights, sparked protests, boycotts, and events like the Boston Tea Party. The harsh response from Britain, including the Intolerable Acts, further united the colonies in their resistance, ultimately culminating in the American Revolution as we know it today. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask me. I'm willing to answer your questions and help you if you need any further guidance on this lesson. Everybody, you can close up your books now. We are finished. And we're going to move on to the next activity which we have set. I just want to say for everyone that listened this far, thank you for listening to my presentation. I know it feels a bit like a lecture, but of course in the classroom there would be more question asking, and it's a more dynamic environment. It's not just me reading off of my notes that I just typed up for this lesson. And of course it would be a lot slower, presented a lot slower in the classroom. Here, I feel you're under more pressure to just speak and get it at the limit, under the limit that you need. But this would, of course, extend longer and be more interesting in the classroom, of course. Thank you for listening, everyone.